All right, guys, I'm back to talk about our last section that we want to consider um, for this week's material, and that is I want to go over the add and remove options that we have here in jQuery. There's more that we can look at with all of these things, the getting and the setting, the adding and removing, but these are the basics behind it. And what I want to look at is basically I want to introduce you as far as adding information to these these four methods here, four functions here: append, prepend, after, and before. And to show you an example of that, I'm going to go back to the, I'm having some issues here. There we go. Go back to the page that we were working on before. And let's talk first about, let's see, what was the first one? Append. Let's talk about append first. So I've added this new paragraph up top here. And when I inspect that, you see that the paragraph has an ID of billing instructions. And so we can actually add, we can append information inside that paragraph tag. And when we append, what we mean is we're going to take information and add it to the very end of the content that's inside that paragraph tag. In other words, just before the closing paragraph tag here, okay? So let's see an example of that. So I'm going to select the paragraph by using its ID. Let me copy its ID up here. We called it billing instructions. So $, open parentheses, double quote, pound, billing instructions in my double quotes. So now I've selected that element, and I'm going to say append. And so it says, please enter your billing information below. Maybe I want to append the text. I want to put a space in there and say, be sure to fill out all fields. Okay. So I hit enter, and sure enough, we see up top that be sure to fill out all fields was added. And if we look at our paragraph tag over here in our HTML code, we see that it's all inside the paragraph tag. All right, why am I pointing that out? Because that's the difference between the append function and the after function. Now let's see, what if we had done the same thing with the after function? Let's try that. All right, so I'm going to reload this page. All right, so it's back to where the condition that it was in before. And instead of doing billing instructions.append, I'm going to do billing instructions.after. Okay, we're going to pass in the same exact information, but we're going to call the after function. Look at what happens. Now the text is added after this information here, but it's down below it. Why is it down below it? Well, because it wasn't added inside of the paragraph tag. It wasn't appended to the content that was inside the paragraph tag. It was added after it, outside of it. So you see, here's our paragraph tag here, here's the opening tag, here's the closing tag, and just after that is the text that we just added right here. Be sure to fill out all fields. So that's the key difference between after and append. Append will add, you know, whatever you pass into the append field is going to get added to the very end of the element, just inside the closing tag of the element. And you can add HTML to that. We'll refresh one more time, and we'll go back to the append method, and we see for maybe I want to bold this here, right? So I'll put a strong tag around this. I'll include some HTML just to show you that the HTML is okay. It doesn't complain about that, so that was fine. And again, because I used append here, if I inspect that, I see that here's my paragraph tag, here's my closing tag, and the new content that I just added was just before the closing tag for that paragraph. Okay, so that's the key difference between append and after. Similarly, our other tags that we want to look at are the prepend and the before, and they work exactly the same way. Prepend is going to add your content to the beginning, but inside the tag, right? So just after the opening tag, whereas before is going to stick it outside of the tag just before it. All right, so let's just do those quickly. I think you get it, but I'll just show you that real quick. So we'll also, instead of append here, we're going to prepend. And that's going to put it inside the tag, inside the paragraph tag, and we're going to prepend to the beginning of this, the content inside the paragraph tag. Let's see, we're just going to say the word note in big letters. All right, make sure they catch that. All right, so if I enter that, we have note at the beginning right here, and if we look at our code, our HTML code, we see that sure enough, note appears right at the beginning of the content, but just after the opening paragraph tag. Right? If I'd done that, um, refresh, if I had done that using before instead of prepend, I think you got it, but let me just show you. If I do that before, it puts note up here. Why does it put note up there? Because if I inspect this and look at the code, we see that here's my paragraph tag, and note appears outside of the paragraph tag, right? Just before the opening tag. All right, so that's the key differences between before and after. And I'm hoping that you know some ideas are popping around in your head now. You're like, okay, cool. That means I can do this or that. Did you kind of see the power of that? Being able to inject your own HTML code into the page wherever you want to by selecting a particular element and either adding content just inside that element at the beginning or at the end of it, or just outside of that element, just before it or just after. All right. So the last thing I want to look at is a couple of methods for removing data, and that is the remove function and then the empty function. And I thought that maybe the best way to show you that one was to look at the drop down that we have here, the state drop down. So let's inspect that. When I go to the state drop down, it's a select form field, and when we learned how to use that, we learned that you have an opening select element, opening and closing select element, and inside of that we have all of the options, and the options are going to be the values that actually appear in the drop down here. Okay, so what's the difference between remove and empty? All right, remove actually removes the selected element and any child element. Empty only removes the child elements from whatever element that we've selected. And what do we mean by child element? Well, the way that they're displaying the HTML here and the way that they're using the indentation makes it pretty clear that all of these options, where you have Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee, all of these option um, elements are inside of this select element, and so they're considered to be children of the select element. Okay, so if I write a jQuery selector that's going to select this select element, this select tag, I'll use the ID value and call that state, is the ID that belongs to that select element. And if I say empty this, what it does is it will keep the select opening and closing select tags on the page, but it's going to remove everything, all of the children that are inside it. So all of the option elements are going to go away. So if I do that, sure enough, they're gone. Right, we see here's our updated HTML code. There's nothing in between the open and closing select tag. Over here on our page, there are no elements in our state, right? So we know how to add some of those back, right? We just learned that you can use the append tag to add it in there. We learned in the last video that you could use sorry, not the append tag, the append function. We learned in the last video that you could use the HTML function to insert something in there. So why don't we just to refresh ourselves on that, why don't we use the HTML element? So we're going to take the state select tag using the ID state, and we're going to add some HTML. And remember, we call the HTML function, and we pass into that function whatever we want to add. So we'll just add one option here, an option tag where the value is going to be, we'll put Georgia in there, Georgia. And we have to use single quotes here because we're using double quotes on the outside so that it doesn't get confused. So we're going to close that. We're going to say Georgia is what's displayed. And then we're going to, and this is, if you don't remember that, that's just we learned that when we learned about how to construct HTML forms. That's how you construct the option tag. Okay, so we're gonna replace the HTML that's currently inside this select tag, which is nothing, right? It's empty right now. And we're gonna replace that with this content. So when I hit enter, sure enough, now I can expand my select tag, and I've got a Georgia option over here, right? So I've got one option in there. Now, if I were to run that code again and say, instead of adding Georgia, well, in addition to adding Georgia, we want to add Tennessee, right? If I do TN in there and I call the HTML function again, look at what happens. Georgia disappears and only Tennessee's in there. And why is that? Because when we call the HTML function, it completely overwrites all the HTML that's in between the tag that we've selected, right? So we didn't actually want to overwrite the value. We wanted to append it to the end of it. So now that Tennessee's there, if we want to stick Georgia in it, we want Georgia to appear before Tennessee, because everybody knows Georgia's better, right? I'm just joking for you, Tennessee, well, sort of. But anyway, if we want to add Georgia before Tennessee now, we want to prepend it, right? That's the function we just learned about there. So let's add that Georgia option back in, and let's call prepend on it, and let's see what happens. Sure enough, here's our select tag, and it's got two values in it, the Georgia value and the Tennessee value. And if we go over here and pull this down, we see that there are two there as well, right? So anyway, empty removes everything, all of the child elements that are in between whatever tag that you've selected. If you want to remove the tag itself and all of the child elements, then that's when you use remove versus empty. So if I call, if on the state, with the state elements selected here, if I call remove on that, it's just going to disappear altogether. So here it is in our HTML. Let's see what happens. I call remove. Sure enough, it's gone, right? It's gone from the page. Here's state where it should have been, right? There's our text just before it, but the actual drop down is gone because we called remove on that. Now, just so you know, this doesn't change any of your actual HTML code that that's saved in your HTML page. It just changes the state of the page right now as the user is viewing that page. Okay, so if I refresh my HTML page, my file didn't get overwritten, right? That's sitting on my system. So if I refresh the page, everything comes back, and all the HTML comes back like it was before. But this allows you to interact with the user, hide and show things, add information to the page, remove information to the page, based on what the user, based on selections that the user makes. One of the common ways that I use stuff like this is, maybe the user is filling out a form and they choose some sort of value from a drop down, and then maybe I show some options in another drop down based on the previous option that they chose. For example, maybe this, if this is an international site, maybe or maybe this is for North America, right? So maybe you have a drop down here that kind of functions as your state or province, right? Depending on whether you're talking about the United States or Canada. And so maybe we have a drop down where you select the US or Canada, and then when you select that, we're going to show certain options in the next drop down. That's those that are the ones that are specific to Canada if they chose Canada, or we're going to show the states options if they chose the United States. So that's how you might use some of that functionality. But just understand the key difference between empty and remove. Remove actually removes the element that you've selected from the page. Empty just removes the child elements, the contents basically of the element that you've selected. Okay, like I said, I'm not going to do a lecture on these last couple of items. CSS class, this is just all about if you need to kind of dynamically apply a CSS class to an element in a page. That'll show you how to do that. We're not going to need that for our end of the year project that we're doing, but I do want you to at least see that you can do that. So I would read through those sections. And dimensions has to do with the setting the height and width of elements, and so there may be instances where that's beneficial as well. Again, not something that we're going to need for this class, but at least something I want you to be aware of, that jQuery gives you the ability to manipulate those values. Okay, all right, you guys have a great day.